Hello, I'm Jesse Mollop and I'm a proud Indigenous man from the Larrakia Nation of the Northern Territory. On behalf of the Imperfects, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which they record this podcast. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to family. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are recognised for telling and sharing stories with one another, and the Imperfects draw inspiration from the oldest living culture in the world as they share stories of their own.
Well, this is exciting.
I was about to start and I was going to say, well, this is exciting. They were my words exactly.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty predictable way for us to start something because it is genuinely exciting.
It is.
Josh, were you going to say this is exciting?
Oh, well, I was thinking it, but I always wait for you guys to say the intro.
Yeah, okay.
Internal monologue.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, no, Hugh, do you want to explain why this is exciting?
If you didn't listen to our introduction episode, this bit's just for you. So the end of about halfway through the last season, we started getting a psychologist, a friend of mine, a friend of Josh's, and
an enemy of mine. Yeah, we do not get along.
And so we were sending all the episodes before we released them for you guys. We would send them out for Em as a psychologist to look at, from a psychologist point of view. Is this just to make sure it wouldn't do any harm? And so over the Christmas break, well, in fact, before that, we did the episode with Georgia, our sister, and I sent it to Em, as we always do, to get her thoughts on it. And
sorry to jump in here. I reckon right now, if you're listening to this and you haven't heard the episode where you read your chapter of your book to Georgia, your sister, probably a good idea to go back and listen to that first and then come back to this episode, because this will be a lot about that. So,
yeah.
So
I sent Em the episode and Em sent me a voice message back with her thoughts on the episode. And I hope this doesn't embarrass you, but I'm just going to play that voice. Is that okay? Yeah. I didn't even check with you.
No, go for it.
Okay, good.
Surprise.
Okay, I'm just going to play this because, I'll play a bit of it anyway. Here we go.
I've just had a listen to that and I am honestly just blown away. Like as a friend, I had a bit of a cry. And I'm actually don't even know what to say. Other than that is incredibly powerful. And my gosh, you guys should be so proud of yourselves. I really genuinely hope that you are. I really can't help but feel for the little Hugh that was 5, and it makes me think about my kids and that's such incredible, powerful work. And the therapist part of me, like I'm not actually genuinely sure what you could do or change. I mean, you've given a trigger warning at the beginning, and I do think that people self-select in my experience, but it is incredible work. So, gosh, I've actually got goosebumps. Well done. I've got heaps of stuff on EMDR, and I'm actually doing the training next year, which is good. And also had all these thoughts about lots of stuff as to why we sometimes are rendered speechless when we are exposed to unpleasant and really distressing information. But I can put that in an email if you'd like.
Okay, so I'll just stop it there. There's a little bit more about the psych point of view, but first of all, that was an amazing voice message to get, Em. Thank you. But it was during that I was thinking, gosh, I would love, when you said you've got more you'd love to chat about and you put in an email, I just remember thinking, gosh, I'd love our listeners to, well, my first thought was I'm going to read that email to the listeners, and then we kind of chatted about it and thought, well, why don't we get Em to actually come onto the show once a month and choose certain parts from episodes that she thinks the listeners might benefit from. And that was kind of the point, listening to that message, that I thought it would be a really good idea. And we're very lucky that Em said yes. The background to Em is I've known Em for a very long time. We met at, I think it was your first part-time job, definitely my first part-time job, yes. working at the cinema, the Ball Cinema.
The greatest job of all time.
I cannot argue with that, the greatest job of all time. So Em I think you would have been 16, maybe 17, and I was 17, 18. But yeah, we met back then and have been very good friends ever since. And it's just, she was over, Josh and I went to Los Angeles to visit our sister, and Soph, Josh's wife, was there as well. And Em happened to be traveling. We caught up with her, and we went through something reasonably traumatic over there. And it was amazing to have Em there as like a psychologist and a friend to help us through.
Yeah.
Like a psycho friend, which actually
Psycho friend. Wow. Well, probably
we have a psycho friend, guys.
a perfect opportunity to officially welcome Dr. Emily to the Imperfects.
Oh.
Dr. Emily, thank you for being a part of this with us.
Oh, honestly, thank you so much for having me. And I think I said to you, I think probably said to all of you at some point, it's really a great privilege being on here with you, because I do think you guys are doing such great work. And I was a little bit reticent about going on for fear in any way that I would kind of damage the brand of the Imperfects, because it's such a, like you got, and as I said, you're doing such an incredible job. So thank you for the privilege and for trusting me a little bit with it.
Well, I can guarantee you when you hear the opener that we're about to play for you, we are going to be harming your reputation much more than you'll ever harm ours. So no, you don't have to fear that. But like we do with all our different episodes, we've got the Vulnerability House, the Academy of Imperfection. They all have their own special opener. So when people tune into it, they know, oh, this is that sort of episode. So last night, Hugh, you haven't heard this yet. I haven't had time to play it to you, but this is the opener that will play at the start of your episodes.
Quick! Is anyone here a doctor? Yes, her name is Dr. Emily, and she's a psychologist. Please welcome to the Imperfects, our very own psychologist!
So apologies. Don't mean to demean or lower the respect level that you already have, but that's just a bit of fun before we go into something a bit more meaningful.
Are you happy? Are you happy with that?
I couldn't think of anything better.
Okay, good. We'll keep it for now. I'll think about ways that I can make it a little bit more respectful.
I think, Em, you could maybe think about playing that as your clients walk into your room.
Yeah, I should have a speaker out there every time you come in the door.
Okay, cool.
Well, maybe to balance that opener, which I love, by the way, but maybe to balance that with just to wrestle a bit of credibility back for him. Mm-hmm. Obviously, coming on here presents some professional, not challenges, but just some considerations you need to go through. So you went and spoke to people, important people. You spoke to important people and asked them what they thought.
I did, just general public. No, I spoke to the advisory people at the APS, which is the Australian Psychological Society, just around, I guess, media and being in the public and providing information as a psychologist. And so I'm bound by a code of ethics, and it just means that there are certain things that I wouldn't want to talk about or provide specific clinical advice to people on a podcast, with the view that if I was to do that, then I could potentially harm viewers out there if they were to take on my advice in that way. So I just really want to be clear that I'm here to provide some information and then point you guys in directions for resources, and I guess to explore and reflect on issues that come up, if that makes sense.
That's great. That's good to know. I mean, as anyone that listens to the podcast regularly knows that I'm the one to turn to for proper advice. So if anyone needs, obviously,
clinical stuff,
obviously, drop me a note, DM me, and I'll shoot you some thoughts. I'm genuinely joking.
Before people start writing to you.
Before you take that seriously.
Dr. Shelton.
Yeah, that is far from the truth. But today, for your very first episode, for the clip that you've brought in today is actually from that final episode of last year called Georgia and Hugh, the last episode of the Imperfects from last year, where Hugh, you read the first chapter of your book, Let Go, to your sister Georgia, which is, of course, about your sister Georgia and confronting the memory and the trauma of her assault as a child. Now, in this clip, it's worth noting that Georgia doesn't say anything, but she is on Zoom listening.
Yeah, she's there.
She's there. Yeah. just beware, she is there listening along. And you can hear this, like we said, hear this episode if you go back and listen to it. But after the clip, we'll come back and Dr. M, you'll give us some thoughts. So let's have a listen.
When I was 6 and Georgia was 3, a stranger came into the front yard of my grandparents' house where we were playing. He picked up my sister and carried her around the side of the house. Then he sexually assaulted her. Georgia didn't tell anyone what had happened and carried the horrible secret throughout her childhood. In 2009, Georgia flew home from her new base in Los Angeles and called a family meeting. As we gathered, At our parents' house, my sister finally revealed, after 23 years, what had happened to her that afternoon at our grandparents' house. During sessions with a therapist, she had unearthed the deeply buried sexual trauma. As she recounted the events of that day, my blood ran cold. The second Georgia described a man coming into our grandparents' yard, I remembered it too. I pictured him walking into the garden and first trying to talk to me. When I didn't respond, I saw him pick up Georgia and carry her around the side of the house. I had no idea what happened next. As Georgia spoke to us that night, I could tell she was broken. My sister was the most vulnerable I had ever seen her, which is saying a lot. When she looked at me with pain in her sight, When she looked at me with pain and sorrow in her eyes, I knew exactly what I had to do. I needed to give her a big hug and say, I was there with you that day. I remember that, man. It was real. You're not crazy. I know it happened. Keep going. I'm here for you. Instead, I stayed silent. For reasons I don't really understand, I just couldn't form the words that might have helped my sister.
Well, that is such a raw bit of audio. But Dr. Emily, like after listening to that clip, which you've brought in, what did you want to talk about?
Look, there were actually quite a few things, but there were kind of three major things that stood out to me. The first kind of really being around some reflections on what that experience was like, first of all, for Hugh, but also Josh didn't have really an opportunity, I guess, to process any of that because it was happening really very much in the moment for you. And so I was hoping maybe to get both of your feedbacks around both what it was like to experience that kind of vulnerability, and then we can talk a little bit more broadly around, I guess, what vulnerability actually feels like, and therefore maybe what kind of gets in the way of us being vulnerable. And then also to get Josh, perhaps maybe what your take on things might have been, and how you're sitting with all of that, I suppose.
Cool.
I love that as a jumping off point, just because so many people message me after that saying, I'm going to talk to a family member over Christmas about something. And I feel like a lot of people probably wouldn't have. Some might have, but a lot wouldn't have and have probably thought it's just too hard. But I think revisiting that now is really important. So, yeah.
Do you have a sense, Hugh, of what for you may have gotten in the way of speaking at any other time?
I just in my head, I thought it's just too hard. Like it's going to be really messy, and there was just a big blocker there. It was just like, and looking back, it's easier to look back on it and say there's just a big block of that. It's just too hard. Like I can't. Like how do I bring it up in the first place? How do I say, hey George, I want to talk to you about something that's going to be really hard for me to talk about? I didn't know how to start the conversation, and then also just thinking, she's fine. Like she's going well. She doesn't. Not that important really. Like I'd make excuses even though if I'd actually stopped to think about it, I would know it was incredibly important for her. But that's the other thing. I just tried not to think about it a lot of the time. So it didn't come off me. Whenever it did, I just thought, George is going pretty well. I'm going fine. We don't really need to revisit this. Well, that was my excuse anyway. So I think that was what stopped me for quite a while.
And when you come back to, like, if you let go of the excuse and if you really sat with that thought about telling her, it sounds like there's a whole host of really uncomfortable feelings that come up when we think about being vulnerable.
Yeah.
It just makes you feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think it's also admitting that to have the conversation, I'd have to admit to Georgia that I was not living up to the standards or values that I'd like to hold myself to. Like it was in the people who haven't listened to the episode, it was me. Georgia said something happened to her when she was younger, and I remembered it, but I just didn't say, yeah, I remember that too. I let her flounder through that moment, and I wasn't there for it. It took 10 years to actually tell her. I think in doing it, I had to say to her, yeah, I did something that I'm not proud of, and it's just that I just chose an easy option to not speak and not speak my side of the story just because it was too hard. So that, to me, I was definitely ashamed of that. I was very ashamed of the fact that I didn't do something courageous and say, yeah, I was there with you. I know what happened. You're not crazy. That definitely happened. I was there, and so proud of you, all that kind of stuff. I chose a weak is the word, but I was definitely a weaker option. I didn't choose the strong and brave option.
That's really interesting, a really interesting point there. And that is just how incredibly painful it feels to be vulnerable. And there are lots of different experiences that we have of vulnerability. You know, it may be approaching someone and talking about something that you feel shameful about. It may be things like talking about health or asking for what you need. But it feels incredibly painful and overwhelming. And if we think about really what's happening when we're asking or showing up, being vulnerable, is we've got this kind of activation really of that fight-flight response. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, I think. But when Brené Brown talks about vulnerability, she talks about in terms of three kind of, or like how she defines it, I suppose, there's three major things, and it's risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And if we think about how it feels to be uncertain, to be exposed, and for it to feel risky, that is not at all a pleasant experience, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's so all those things. In fact, if you listen back to it, the times that I was like very emotional in the points that I felt like I'd let Georgia down. Like they're the times that I found it hard to talk to her when I felt like I had let her down and I wasn't a good brother to her. So that was like the emotional pain part, I guess. That was very painful to actually say that stuff to her. So, yeah.
So you had to sit with a lot of pain to actually tell her.
Yeah, and to relive the event, horrific event, to relive it in my head. Like to be able to think about it and talk about it, I had to try and remember it properly and make sure my memory as a 5-6-year-old was accurate. And yeah, it's awful thing to think about, especially when I have kids who are very nearly approaching the same age as George and I were then. So my kids are 5 and 2 and we were 6 and 3. So picturing them in that scenario, which I can't have to do, that is unbelievably painful.
It's interesting. It's not necessarily unusual if we experience difficulty or traumatic events when we're little, that when we become adults and we have children potentially that start to reach the same age that traumatic event happened for us, it can actually start to activate, different experiences that are really very reminiscent of what happened to us when we were little. So, maybe we could hypothesize potentially that even kind of having kids has brought you even kind of further into that readiness to talk about it. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't want to interpret too much and I'm not your therapist, but I've certainly kind of seen that anecdotally that, when we have children, we can now see the vulnerability of the child that we couldn't recognize necessarily for us at the time, because when we're kids, we don't have that kind of awareness. But you start to see what it would be like for your child to have been in that situation.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. It also gave me permission to forgive myself a little bit, because I look at Benji now, my 5-year-old, playing with Elsie, and I know there's no way he could do anything to stop a grown man, if like a bad person like that wanted to do something. He couldn't. I mean, he can get very angry. He can get really angry at times, but he couldn't actually stop something like that happening. So I guess that was pretty powerful for me and actually also saying that to Georgia, that was like, she said to me, you couldn't have done anything. And I wanted to argue that I could have, but then I thought of Benji and I thought, no, I couldn't have. So I forgave myself. So that's really interesting. I think I hadn't thought about that, but I think there's very little doubt that there's something happening there with the age of my kids and the age of what Georgia and I, when we went through that, for sure. Yeah.
And what was it like for you, Josh, to listen to all then?
I just before we go on to that, I just think it's fascinating that we have an inability to judge our behavior through the lens of the person we were at the time. We can only judge it through the person we are now. So like I find it shocking that it took Georgia saying to you couldn't have done anything for you to realize that you couldn't have done anything. I would have thought that was kind of obvious, but it feels like you were kind of almost looking at yourself as a 5-year-old through the agency and actions of a grown man.
Yeah.
And they're the stories that we tell ourselves over and over again, like throughout our lives.
Yeah.
It's really like when we talk about trauma, it's really quite complex. And I'll talk a little bit about it later on particularly in terms of memory, because when we experience trauma, the way in which we process information, like incoming information, is very different to how you would process it, like to process everyday normal information. And part of the reason for that is that we have the release of different chemicals in the body, adrenaline and cortisol, and they actually change the function of memory, of how memory is stored and encoded.
Really?
So it's like how you might be able to remember something very vividly as though it's happening right now, primarily because that particular memory, whichever one you're referring to, was potentially encoded quite differently to what like a normal memory might be. So you won't necessarily remember getting dressed 2 days ago and what that felt like, but you can remember very vividly what particular events that were quite profound felt like.
And so it's almost like the memory is being like the memory is washed in these chemicals almost, and it's sort of like being embedded at the time, and it's that chemical composition that can affect how the memory is, or how the memory is stored and held.
Yep, 100%.
Wow.
So it's almost like you've got a really disorganized, messy filing cabinet that we can't and we don't know how to bring out information when we need it. Whereas in a normal everyday life, it's like we've got our memories are filed and organized very easily, so we can just take out what we need. But trauma fundamentally changes the way in which we experience and process information in the moment.
It's just a weird one for me though to hear that, because that memory for a long time wasn't traumatic. In fact, it was so non-consequential at that time in my life. Like a man walked into the front yard, he said something to me, I can't remember what it was, and then he picked up Georgia and went around the side of the house, and I thought, oh, that's one of Grandpa's friends, and I don't know what's happening there. But somehow it was still in there. Like something happened when I was 6, but I'd forgotten about it, if you know what I mean. And then when Georgia told us about it, it came like charging back to me like at 100 miles an hour, and my blood ran cold because I went, oh no, I do remember that. So all of a sudden it became a traumatic memory, but it wasn't originally. We're getting off the topic a little bit here, but that's just an interesting one to hear for me, because I now, I feel sick when I think about it, but I hadn't thought about it for a long time because I didn't know it was I didn't know it was a life-changing. I mean, it was so life-changing, right, that it changed Josh's life, and he wasn't even born yet. Like it had a huge impact on Josh's life, and he wasn't born. That's how big that moment was for my family. But I didn't even know at the time. Like it was just another thing.
And how would you? How would you know?
No,
as a 5-year-old.
No, there's absolutely. I don't think I'm a bit confused with it all, because I think maybe part of me has told myself that I shouldn't know, just to forgive myself, just to make sure that just in case I had a feeling that man was a bit wrong, I didn't do anything. I don't know. Anyway, we're probably getting a little bit into my own story.
I'd like to come back to that at some point if we can.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Definitely.
Josh, did you want to say
only about how it all felt to hear it. A bit weird actually. I didn't listen to it again until last night because I knew I had to for this, and I didn't really want to. I sort of feel like potentially, I was talking to Soph afterwards about it, and she said this is very off-brand for your persona on the podcast, but I kind of just felt like it's not my business. And it's not my story.
Yeah, right.
And I don't really have too much to say about it, because it feels very much like Hugh and George's story. And maybe that's a cop-out and I'm trying to avoid talking about stuff. Potentially there's stuff there that I'm not ready to talk about, and the idea that I just feel like there's an external factor here to talk about stuff.
Like an external pressure.
Like an external pressure. To talk about it, and I just don't really know what I want to say or think or have to say about the whole thing. Does that all make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, I wonder, and like I'm definitely, I think I said this, but I'm not your therapist. And I don't want to ask any kind of probing questions or anything like along those lines. But I think kind of just paying attention to that and noticing like that's your response, right? So that's the feeling that's showing up for you. And if it doesn't feel comfortable, it doesn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I do want to acknowledge too that I imagine, to be honest, probably hearing your siblings talking publicly too might have felt a bit disorienting or a bit disarming too.
It's a bit, it's a bit difficult. It's because I have friends coming up to me wanting to, especially that episode. I had a few friends more than normal wanting to talk, and I was like, I don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's like, I mean, from my point of view, like I'm just like, of course, yeah, of course, that external pressure that you were talking about. There's certainly nothing there's nothing on this podcast that needs to be talked about ever. Like, and we know that. And like, sometimes I know that feeling where you're approaching an episode, which I've been in a situation where it's like, okay, I'm talking about that thing today. And part of me sometimes goes like, the feeling of like, I have to, even though I want to. It's different than your situation. But I relate to that feeling of a pressure, whether it be like, and hopefully you don't feel the pressure from us, but maybe it's more just like the pressure of like a show that's like a vulnerable show, and that's just made up by us. And I think it makes me think about actually what Georgia says like so eloquently, and I will always remember what she said, where she said to you, Hugh, that you weren't ready to talk about it. Like it just, and I think that is just, I don't know if there's anything you can talk about in regards to that, but that situation of like not being ready to talk about it, not knowing that you're not ready, but just like physically or emotionally or wherever you are in your life, like there's a bunch of stuff that's happened to me in the last 5 years that sometimes I go like, God, I wish I realized that 10, 15 years ago, but I just wasn't in the position to be able to accept it, even if I did think about it.
Mm-hmm. Look, there might be lots of reasons as to why there isn't a readiness for us to talk about stuff, or even whether there feels like there is a necessity at any point to talk about our experiences. With respect to hearing really overwhelming news, there is a very kind of neurological basis as to why we may not, in those moments, actually express what's happening for us or express what we would like to express. And I can kind of explain that a little bit more if you want me to.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, please.
From like a neurological point of view. So if we think about, actually there's a really great book that I'd recommend, and I'll pass on the show notes. And it's by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. So it's very accessible. But Dr. Perry is a child psychiatrist and neuroscientist, and he talks about understanding how we are processing information in terms of the brain and looking at it as though it's like an inverted triangle. So if you imagine, we view the brain as an inverted triangle, whenever we, moment to moment, everyday life, all of the information that the body receives, that the mind is receiving, is processed from the most primitive parts of our brain first, and then it goes up kind of the order of kind of evolution, up the triangle to the most evolved part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. So at the bottom of the triangle is where we process essentially whether we are currently safe or unsafe. Mm-hmm. And when the body determines essentially that it's safe, then we move up to kind of normal human functioning, where we're calm, we're engaged. Essentially, if we feel safe, we can be curious, we can be creative. We use problem solving, planning, all that sort of stuff. So that's when we're feeling calm. Now, if in a moment the body detects some sort of threat in its environment, then it won't necessarily go right up the chain again up to the top to the prefrontal cortex.
So that's like emotional danger as well. Sorry to interrupt him, but that's like, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it can be, the body can be detecting like a physical threat through awareness of our senses, or it can be a threat from internally. So it might be a sensation that you notice in the body of discomfort. It might even be things like feeling hungry or feeling thirsty. So we've got two aspects, what's happening in our environment and what's happening inside of us at the same time. And so the body and the brain are constantly kind of detecting whether we are safe or whether we're not safe. If it's safe, then we move into normal kind of human adaptive functioning. If it's not safe, things change. And this is where you guys would be really familiar with the activation of the fight or flight response. So if you imagine in the wild, let's just say an antelope detects a lion approaching, then it will quickly activate the release of adrenaline into the bloodstream that will make sure that the antelope can flee quickly. We get changes in our heart rate, so heart rate increases. We get dilation of pupils so we can see better. The ears become more acute with hearing. So these particular functions help us to stay alive. It was originally designed for that activation to be very short so that when we would reach safety, we would then return to kind of a sense of balance and calm. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
our dog got attacked the other day by, I'll say the other day, it was 2 years ago now, but our dog got attacked by another dog, and the dog was genuinely trying to kill him. Like, there was no question, but he had quite a big harness on. It couldn't lock its jaw around our dog's neck. And it was it was awful for us to watch. Like, it was horrific, but he managed to escape, and the other dog went off with its owner. And I literally watched it. I was like, our dog's going to be a mess here. Like, he's going to be so upset. And then he saw another dog approaching. He went off and played with him in the river very happily. Like, and I remember thinking, geez, he literally shook it off. Like, he shook for about 20 seconds. And then he was like, oh, another dog. You're a beauty.
Yeah. And that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's exactly it. And then there's like a discharging of emotion there. So then we return to kind of this idea of equilibrium or balance. There is, though, another state of functioning that will occur if that fight or flight response isn't actually working. And what I mean by that is that if the body is detecting that this particular danger is inescapable, then a fight-flight response isn't actually adaptive. So what it will do, and what I mean by that is, like, if an antelope, for example, has been caught. And so in that moment, that antelope cannot escape. Right?
Yep.
And so the body, all mammals, have this function of what's called dissociation. And this is this kind of the most primitive function of the human brain. And its intention is to prepare for injury. And so what will happen is that we get actually a different activation in the autonomic nervous system, which actually slows our heart rate. And so we kind of go into this state of stillness, and it produces endorphins, and it releases endorphins with the view that endorphins are a natural painkiller. So when that antelope gets bitten, it doesn't feel the effects of pain. Now, if we translate that to human functioning, that is that moment that we've all probably had moments of this, where you feel like you've suddenly become really disconnected in the moment. Almost like you're almost floating above yourself, or it feels like things are really slowing down and you can't quite kind of reach out or connect with people. Does that resonate?
Totally.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Can I give another very quick story off that? But this happened to me two days ago in the pool with Elsie and Benji. And again, Vance, the dog, he was running off with my shoes, so I stopped watching them. Like, I'm way over the top protective when they're in the pool. I barely, I need to relax a bit. But Vance took off my shoe and was trying to destroy it, so I was yelling at him. And I turned around again, and Elsie she's 2. She obviously can't swim, and she was gone. She was under the water, and she was about a foot under the water, and she was just slowly sinking. And she'd given up. She wasn't trying to splash. She was just... And exactly what you said just then, time slowed down. Like, I was only a couple of meters away from her, but I felt like I was on a treadmill. I just couldn't get to her, even though I was probably there very, very quickly. But I also had no feeling. Like, there was no, it was the most bizarre. I actually can't get the picture of it out of my head the last couple of nights, so I'm trying to go to sleep. But it was probably over the course of 1 second that I saw her and got out of the water, but it felt like 20 minutes. And got her out of the water, and she was vomiting up water and stuff. And then I started to slowly think again properly, but everything had gone. I felt like everything had completely shut down. I remember thinking, why didn't I get the crazy fight or flight like thing happening there? Maybe I was preparing for pain. I don't know, because the second I saw it actually looked like it was too late. It was awful. Sorry, I'm turning this into a therapy session now. So.
No. I think that what you're saying is really important. And the way I want to tie that back to your episode with Georgia, and this is where it really resonated with me, and whether this was happening for you, I don't know. But when you described in your book and in telling Georgia that your blood ran cold when you heard her describe what had happened, that to me sounded like this experience of dissociation. So kind of this drifting, like almost like literally kind of moving away.
Wow.
Everything was slowing down. And what is so paramount in understanding that is that the more threatened we feel, the less functional we are from an IQ point of view. So we can't access all of the higher order parts of the brain that tell us all the rational things that we should say. So the things that you wanted to say in retrospect, we actually can't access that part of the brain. And so if we look at it in like on a spectrum, essentially, it's almost like the more threatened you are, the less smart you can be. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Wow.
Would that be like if you're in an argument with your partner, all of a sudden you can't think of what like, like all of a sudden you're like, why? Why can't I argue that point? Why?
It's the classic George Costanza, like getting fired, and then in his car, he's like, "That's what I should have said."
Yeah.
You know,
that is exactly it.
Yeah.
And the reason is because in the moment we feel too threatened. So our kind of body's reaction is to keep it safe as possible, but we lose contact with the prefrontal cortex. So it's only afterwards when you kind of get back to safety that you think of all the things that you could have or wanted to say.
So what about people who are, I admire people who are very good at arguments. Like when it gets really heated, like because believe it or not, Em, I don't like confrontation. And so when I'm in a confrontation, how you're explaining the brain, I relate to it so much. But there are obviously people who, when a confrontation happens, they come into their own and they're incredible. So how are they different? Like how are their brains different?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it's not that their brains are different. It may be that a conflict doesn't feel as threatening to them. Can I just tell you really quickly? In the book that I was referencing before, Bruce Perry provides information about our functional IQ changing. And it goes from like in a calm state, we have on average an IQ. Well, if you're an average person, you have an IQ of about 100 to 120. If you're in a state of terror, then that IQ, that functional IQ comes down to 80 to 60.
Whoa.
So it's like potentially halving
your intelligence.
Yeah. And I shouldn't say it's not halving your intelligence. It's basically compromising your ability to use the rational part of the brain.
Yeah.
The part that thinks.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. And then this is a normal thing, you're saying? This is a normal thing to have,
Yeah, and it's normal and it's also involuntary.
Yeah.
So I'm going back to the topic of like having an argument with your partner, because I feel like a lot of people might relate to that. But
everything okay, Hugh?
Yeah.
So, everything all right?
No, I wonder if you want to have a productive discussion with your partner, the aim is to make it feel really safe for each other. I don't know how you do that, but like we just could like try and make this. We both disagree really strongly on this. How do we make this? I'm going to couples therapy now, which is not the point of this, but anyway, that's just a thought. Anyway,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Em, thank you so much. I mean, this has been. I mean, unless Hugh, there's something else you wanted to.
Yeah, there was just one more thing, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about vulnerability on this podcast. One of the things I've learned is that vulnerability is not always a great thing to just jump into blindly, and especially where trauma is involved. Em, I'd love to get your take on when we're being vulnerable, what are the things we need to look out for, and especially when someone is dealing with trauma from their past.
Yeah, I mean, it's really complex trauma, and obviously it's dependent upon what kind of trauma and how extensive, and also what has happened in your life before the trauma. So it's kind of difficult to know, but I guess in terms of being vulnerable, for me, the biggest thing is who are we being vulnerable with and how much do we trust them? So it needs to be kind of that you feel safe enough in whatever way, whether that's you doing therapy first or not. I think that you just need to feel safe with whoever you're being vulnerable.
Yeah.
If that remotely answers your question.
No, it totally does. Thank you for that.
That's great. And probably a good spot to wrap up the very first episode.
I love episodes so much.
Yeah. Wow. We'll see how we go. But
I think I want to hear. Oh no, so I want to hear the theme song again. But is it weird to? It's probably best to save it for the next one.
Yeah, I'll maybe make a few tweaks before the next one too. I feel like as I was playing, I was like, yeah, I think it's gonna be a bit better. Anyway, I'll have a play.
I feel like I need a cape or something with that episode.
Yeah. That's
we can
true.
send you one. That's fine.
Definitely.
A cape would be
great.
good. Yeah, that'd be extremely respectful, I think. Dr. Emily, that was unbelievable. Thank you for being a part of the show, and thanks for all that incredible insight. That was amazing.
Yeah, I always feel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, just as a friend from a long time, I just listen to you go. I'm so proud of him. Like, look at all the stuff she knows. She's amazing.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you.
Well, we'll speak to you in a month, Em.
Sounds great. All right. See you soon,
See you,
guys.
Doctor.
Yeah.
Bye.
If this episode has been triggering for you, we strongly recommend Lifeline on 131114. The Imperfects is hosted and co-produced by Hugh Van Cuylenberg, Ryan Shelton and Josh Van Cuylenberg. This episode was produced by Bridget Northeast, edited by Jamison Moore, filmed by Andy Poole and social mediated by George Martin. A special thanks to Dr. M for her expertise and guidance. We'd also like to thank the Resilience Project for their ongoing support. Our acknowledgement of country was delivered today by Jesse Motlop, and you can find Jesse's podcast, Deadly Discussions, on YouTube. Thanks for listening.